Welcome to PDSA, the Heart of the Matter. A portion of this presentation was delivered at the January 2017 meeting of the Leaders of Learners. PDSA is an organized and intentional way to improve learning processes at the classroom, campus, and district level. In this program, you will better understand how PDSA fits in with the other components of continuous improvement, why use of PDSA is important in our continuous improvement efforts, and see an example of what PDSA might look like in the classroom. In order to understand the importance of PDSA, let's first take a look at a conceptual model for the types of data that are available in educational systems to inform decision making. This model is based on the work of Victoria Bernhardt. The first type of data available to us is demographic data. This includes the characteristics of students, such as race, ethnicity, or gender, as well as other data, such as attendance and graduation rate. Demographic data also apply to staff, families, and community factors. Typically, schools have a large amount of information about demographics. The second type of data commonly used in schools is related to student learning. Any sort of assessment data, such as test results or grades, provide insight as to how well students are learning. As student learning is the major outcome of any educational system, these types of data are commonly available to students, teachers, parents, and community. Another type of data used in schools is about the perceptions of students and other stakeholders in the system. These types of data are often collected informally or through more formal avenues such as through surveys or focus groups. Finally, data are sometimes available about the processes we have in place. These could be about allocation of funds to various programs, how well we transport students to and from school, and the effectiveness of our instructional programs. Teachers, administrators, and all school district staff are hired to develop and implement processes. However, it's common that information about the efficiency and effectiveness of our learning processes is often lacking. And while demographics and perceptions may influence how well students learn, we have much more control over school processes than we do about these other forms of data. The PDSA process falls at the interface between school processes and student learning. PDSA helps us to evaluate the effectiveness of our processes and to improve them so that we can maximize student learning outcomes. In the continuous improvement framework, learning processes are all the things we do to improve student learning in the classroom and outside the classroom. It is hoped that the quality and effectiveness of our learning processes will help lead to the performance results that we are trying to achieve through our mission and goals. Intentional use of PDSA forces us to stop along the way to ask questions about how well our processes are working and what we can do to improve those processes. And as our learning processes improve, we will also improve our performance results, which is the core purpose of our continuous improvement efforts. So, why should we use PDSA in education? It was originally developed as a way to improve manufacturing processes, so how could it possibly help us? Our school system has inputs, which are the students who walk through our doors, and outputs, which are the measures of how well our graduates are prepared for college and career. Unlike most manufacturing industries, we do not have much control over the inputs to our system. Therefore, if we want to have predictable quality outputs to the system, we must put responsive processes in place. To respond, we must monitor what we're doing, evaluate the effectiveness of our actions, and make adjustments when they're not as effective as we need them to be. PDSA is a process designed to improve our processes. To summarize, here are some reasons why we should use PDSA in our classrooms. First, it's an intentional and purposeful process to improve student learning outcomes. It also helps everyone to understand our learning goals and the strategies best used to achieve them. PDSA gives action to achieving the organization's mission and strategic goals, and it gives students voice, choice, and ownership in their own learning with increased engagement. Finally, it works to improve student learning. So why wouldn't we want to use it in our classrooms? Now let's take a look at how PDSA fits into the work we do at schools over the course of a year. We have learned how to create smart strategic goals to set direction for student learning over the entire year. Using our football analogy, we call these strategic goals our championship learning goals. Now we don't want to wait until the end of the year to find out if we're on track to meet our goals. So we track student performance on a number of benchmarks that will tell us how well students are progressing. For each benchmark, we set a performance goal that's aligned with the annual strategic goal. At the beginning of the year, we will put into place a PDSA cycle of improvement designed to help students meet the first game goal for learning. This could be about performance on a district CBA, a campus 6 weeks test, or some other measure of student performance that would show progress toward the annual strategic goal. We would then use the data from the first PDSA cycle to inform us about how well our learning processes are working, and use that information to make improvements for the next and each subsequent cycle of learning prior to the big championship goal assessment, such as STAR. Within each of these larger PDSA cycles, we may have several shorter cycles of learning taking place in the classroom based on units of instruction from 1 to several weeks in length. In this way, we are constantly collecting data on the effectiveness of instruction and learning processes, and making adjustments along the way so that we can meet our larger goals by the end of the year. In fact, it's through these short cycles of improvement that we can see learning progress being made and provide timely response when students are not learning. These PDSA cycles happen at the classroom level, which is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to student learning. This is where conversations between teachers and students about learning take place, which leads to a greater student ownership in their own learning. One last idea to consider is the importance of working through all 4 steps of the PDSA cycle. Let's consider the heart and the cardiac cycle as an analogy. You all recall from your 7th grade science class that blood enters the heart from the body into the right atrium. From there it travels to the right ventricle, which contracts and forces blood to the lungs. Blood returns from the lungs to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, which then sends blood back to the body through the aorta. If any chamber of the heart is damaged, the entire cycle breaks down and blood flow is compromised. It's also important to use all 4 components of PDSA in improving learning processes. You can't be effective in what you do without first coming up with a viable plan based on past performance. Often in education, we leave out the study and act components because we typically are action-oriented, problem-solving people. When confronted with a problem, we want to fix it, so we come up with a plan and perform actions. However, if we focus only on the plan and the do, we may not take the time to really study whether our actions have led to the outcomes we intended. And even if we study whether or not we've met our goals, we may not take the time to identify a prescription as to how to improve our processes the next time they're needed. Without paying attention to the study and the act, we will not improve our processes. Next, let's hear an example of how PDSA is used in the classroom.
Today I'm going to lead you through a sample classroom PDSA so that you can see the big picture and get a feel for how this process works. Before we get started with the nitty-gritty details of each of the pieces of PDSA, I want you to see what this looks like as it all works together. I also want to remind you that above your PDSA, you should have your championship goals posted along with your game goals so that students can see the relationship between not only championship goals and game goals, but the PDSA goals that you will place in the plan section of your cycle. In a perfect world, this is what Plan, Do, Study, Act would look like. On Monday, you would do the plan and do, or whenever you begin those new standards or a new unit. And then on Friday, you would do the study and act portion of the PDSA, or whenever the moment is when you give your assessment. However, we don't always live in a land where there are unicorns and rainbows. But for most of us, we live here, where there is never enough time and we constantly have things to do that are piling up on our desk. So I'm going to walk you through how I used PDSA in my classroom and how I also encourage the teachers on my campus to use it as well. There is a recursive nature of PDSA. I begin my PDSA cycles Monday morning and I start with a study. And then I move to the act. And then for the week coming up, I begin with a new P and a D. So the P and the D and the S and the A don't usually match, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So let's get started. I would gather my class around my PDSA wall so that it is something that they can constantly look at, interact with, refer to, and we would start with the study. So I gave an assessment on Friday. Let's see how it went. I want to know if they learned the standard that I was teaching. So I would post my data. On this particular graph, I have not only a goal line for my advanced scores, but also for my goal and then for those students who passed. So we would refer back to that. We would celebrate our successes. We would look at the things that we didn't quite meet our goal on and talk about those. Then there is a second part of study that many times I see people put in the ACT side of a PDSA cycle, but really this belongs in the study part. Most of the time, I put my plus delta chart in between my study and my ACT boxes simply because I don't have enough space. But the second part of our study needs to be a plus delta on how it went last week. Let's talk about the pluses, what worked well for our learning. Were there some things that we might want to repeat this week that went well? And the deltas, what were some things that got in the way or hindered our learning? What would we want to figure out or adjust or change? So we would have a conversation around this plus delta and how things went the previous week. So now let's move on to the ACT portion of the PDSA cycle. This is where we talk about the things that we need to fix. I love looking at data, and so the study part is my favorite part because I like to break apart the data. I love to look closely at it. But truly, the ACT portion of a PDSA cycle is the most important. This is the part where we reflect. And many times, reflection makes teachers a little nervous. And so they're not always really sure what to put in the ACT box on their PDSA wall. Many times when you look at pictures that David has taken of PDSA cycles, you'll notice that the ACT portion is blank or it's empty. There's nothing in that box. So let me help you out with that a little bit. As you think about doing a plus delta with your students, I really want you to remember that deltas are the things that got in the way of their learning. That is the problems. It's not solutions. The ACT portion is where the solutions come in. So for example, you might have a student that says, we need to have new seating arrangements next week. Well, that's a solution. So that wouldn't go into the delta box. That's going to go into the ACT box. Instead, the problem might be that the table mates that he was sitting with were disruptive or were a distraction, or maybe there was too much talking going on. You want to get to the root of really what is the problem, because maybe there's a different solution than changing up everybody's seat. But Make sure that when students are talking about deltas to you, that they are problem based, not solution focused, that there is the problem. Because when you get to the act portion, that's when you want to talk about the things that you need to fix and how you're going to fix them. So, this is also a great time to talk about interventions. What are you going to do at teacher table to help those students learn those standards? This is where you really need to spend some time reassuring those students who didn't meet the goal that you're going to help them, that we're going to help them as a team, that we're going to help them as a class to learn those standards, to learn the things that maybe they didn't quite understand or grasp the following week. So, talk about that as a class. Talk about how you're going to fix the things that were a problem. Okay, I want to stop for just a minute here and say you do not have to do your PDSA cycle from beginning with study and moving to act on up to plan and then do. But if you need some time to grade your assessment and post the data in your study portion of your PDSA, then you're probably going to do your cycle in this manner. So the study and the act portion of your PDSA cycle are going to be based upon the previous week's data or information. And then I would move on to my plan. So we went through the study piece from our test on Friday. We talked about how we're going to fix our problems. Now I want to talk to you about the plan for this week. We're going to look at what TEKS are we going to learn? What goal do we want to set? So this part of the PDSA cycle is focused on what are we going to do this week together as a team. We're going to talk about what students need to be able to do, what they need to know, and then how am I, as the teacher, going to know that they learned it? So the plan also has two parts. Okay, so the plan has two parts. The first part is the standard, or the TEKS, that you're going to learn for the week. I'm using a third grade example. I figured that was pretty middle of the road in elementary. And then the second portion that is important to include in your plan is the goal. How will you know that students were successful learning that standard and understanding what they were supposed to do? I want you to know that both of these parts are important. And sometimes we have seen plans that only have a goal or they only have the standard. And I realize that some of you will say, well, I post my standard and I do that, but it's in a different place in my room. I'm going to strongly encourage you to put it in the plan portion of your PDSA cycle. You can keep it in the other place in your room, but it also needs to go here because this clearly tells students what they are going to need to know and be able to do at the end of the cycle. Let's talk about the standard. This is the place where I would have my mini lesson. I'm going to go through, I'm going to deconstruct this standard. We're going to talk about how it connects to my spotlight TEK. I'm going to underline and circle and draw pictures about what is important in this standard. I'm going to talk about the word identify. We're going to talk about the words details or facts. I want them to know that it has to support the main idea. And then, of course, I'm going to spend some time on what does main idea really mean. I'm going to make my anchor charts. I'm going to put them in my TEKS verb. This is where I'm going to explain to them what does this standard mean? What is this all about? So that they have a clear understanding of what it is that I'm talking about when I say this is what I want you to know and to be able to do. The second portion is the goal. How will you know if they learned the standard? So this can be something that is non-negotiable. You can create your goal before your kids ever walk in the door. So here's the goal for my classroom. All students in Miss Minix's class will score an 80 or above And at least 40%, 46% of the students will receive an advanced score. We're going to talk about what the main idea quiz is going to look like. I'm going to tell them what that expectation is so that going into this week, there is no question as to how they're going to be graded on whether they learned this material. If it's a project, if it's some other sort of assessment that you want them to do, they need to know how are you going to know if they learned it. I even put the date. We're going to take this test on January 27th, and I'm going to talk to them about what that looks like. We also, because of my championship goal and my game goals, we've also had a lot of conversation about what does an advanced score mean. Because in my championship goal, it talks about advanced scores. In my game goal, it talks about advanced scores. So my kids are clear that an advanced score means that it's 90% or higher. Let me also take a second to tell you that these goals are going to change. I chose for this standard for my goal to be 80%. I know that this week we're going to do a really great job at understanding and learning about main idea. They're going to be able to identify main ideas with details or facts, and it's not going to be a difficult standard. So I went a little bit higher on my percentage. Let me also talk to you about the first two words, all students. For me, this is important because the culture of my classroom is one where no student is left behind. We don't leave any of our teammates behind. We want for everybody to be successful. I want every person in my classroom to strive for greatness, and I'm going to call out greatness in every one of my kids every single day. And 80% might be very, very difficult for some of the kids in my class. And I understand that and I know that. But I'm going to push them and we're going to try hard to get to that goal. I also am not willing to tell Johnny, oh, you know what, Johnny? I'm going to not put all students, and we're going to say 95% of my kids will be able to meet this goal because Johnny and Susie won't make the goal, and I already know that, so I'm not willing to include them. I'm not ready to tell Johnny and Susie that. I'm certainly not willing to call Johnny and Susie's parents and say, I'm sorry, I'm leaving your kids out in the ocean while the rest of us are in the boat and we're pressing on. I just can't. I can't bring myself to do that. And that's not the culture that I have created in my classroom. We're a team, we're a family, and that's how we function and that's how we work. So it's important to me to include the words all students, and we have a conversation about that. So it does not all have to be all if you're comfortable with that, and it does not have to be 80 if you need it to be 70 or you need it to be 75. Whatever it is that you feel comfortable putting on that percentage, do that. 46% is going to change as well. Sometimes it's a difficult standard. So think about that. And then you can always do something other than a quiz. It does not have to be paper pencil. It can be a project. This is completely up to you. It's all about letting your kids know what the goal is and how you're grading them on that standard. The next part of our PDSA cycle is the do. How are you going to reach your goals? What are you going to do with your students in order to make this happen? This is where you're going to make a list of the things that will go on during the learning, during the instruction. It might include things like what will you do as the teacher? What will the students do individually and together? And then I love it when teachers include things that parents might do or other staff or tutors and broaden that scope out a little bit. But this is a great way to talk about what are the major things that you're going to do together as a class in order to reach your goal. I want to brainstorm with you some things that you might want to include in the do box as you're working through this process with your students. You can include things such as I will do and you will do. Make a list of the commitments that you're willing to do and the things that you really want students to engage in as well. You can include pictures, especially in the lower grades. It's great for you to post pictures of the things that you are planning on doing with them during this unit. I love taking pictures of your own kids and putting those examples, having them model the things that you want for them to do in the do box. You can also include task cards. I have lots of task cards that I'm willing to share with you. Most of them have clip art on them. There might just be lists of ideas and things that you could do together. So I'm more than happy to share those with you. We talked briefly about putting things on your do list that students could do at home or with their parents. Also, you may have already seen somebody do a tic-tac-toe board, which involves student choice. So the teacher lists 9 different things that they want for their students to do on the boards, and then the students get to choose which 3 they would like to do in order to make a tic-tac-toe. I always love it when teachers put something on their do list that shows the students making connections to the standards. I want them to understand that the reason that we're doing what we do is in order to reach our goal, is in order to learn the standard at high levels. These are just a few reminders as you are doing the do. Remember that you are in control of the do. When you get ready to do this part in your PDSA cycle, you can give the students as much control and choice as you want to. It's always great to offer choice. It's always wonderful to get their input because usually that provides more buy-in for them. But there are activities that you know that they are specifically going to do. So you can choose anytime you want to facilitate manipulate this part. Let them think that they're helping you maybe more than they are, but don't allow it to take too long. This is where you can fall into the trap of spending too much time negotiating what you are going to do that week to learn those standards. I'm going to give you a few minutes to process the things that you have heard. I've given you a lot of information, and I want you to let some of that soak in for a few minutes. So I also know that we are all over the map when it comes to PDSA. Even in the same building, we are all over the place. Some teachers have been using PDSA for years. Some have never even heard of PDSA. So I want to ask you a few questions such as, what are the areas that you are struggling with? If you have done PDSA, do you get caught up in the act? Does it take you too long to do the do's? What is it that you struggle with? Are there areas that you feel very comfortable with and that you do on a consistent basis? I know from talking to David Holland and Dr. Clark that we do a really great job in this district of looking at those standards, breaking them apart, and so that's something that we're comfortable with now, that we're not going to have a problem with just placing that into our plan. So I want you to turn and talk and share with the person sitting next to you if you have been using PDSA, if you're just starting off, and talk to them about how you can either begin the process or maybe you need to tweak and fine-tune some things that you're already doing. I want to give you a few important reminders before we wrap this up. Remember that this is a process with interdependent parts. You cannot do just one part of this process and get the same results that you're going to get when you use all 4 pieces of this process. They will not yield those same results. You have to do all of them. So if you have been going about this and you have been doing the plan and the do, but you don't do the study and the act, or maybe you just do the plan and the study and you leave out the do and the act, it doesn't matter. They all rely on each other. So do the process in its entirety. I'm also going to strongly encourage you to start small. Pick one subject. If you teach math is a great subject to start with because it's very concrete, it's laid out, it's sequential. So that's an awesome subject that I encourage people to start with. But pick one subject. Pick one class. If you're a specials teacher, Pick one class to do this with. My teachers at Smithfield have been doing this now for 4 years, and I only have my teachers doing 2 subjects at this point. So don't try to do too much, because if you do, you will not be able to keep up with it. Take it in small bites, pick one subject at a time. And then I'm also going to tell you, make time to do it. Put this in your schedule. Put it in your lesson plans. If you want to have a morning meeting like I did, schedule it Monday morning so that you know that you have carved out time to do this. Also, this is not on the slide, but I want to tell you this. Your PDSA board does not have to be pretty. It does not have to come from Teachers Tools or Pinterest. It can be a piece of paper that you have taped to a cabinet. I use double-sided tape to just stick my plans on top of each other so that we can look through them. This is not something that has to cost a lot of money, and it does not have to be picture perfect. And finally, I want to leave you with this. I tell my teachers this every single time we talk about continuous improvement or anything that we try that is new, to fail fast, to get in there and mess it up, because I can promise you that everybody's going to make mistakes, and that's how we learn. So one tiny step at a time, you will do an amazing job, and I cannot wait to hear your stories of how successful the PDSA cycle has been in your classroom.